The moment the dropship's side hatch hissed open, Ava Monroe felt her breath catch in her throat. Gravitura 7 looked like the aftermath of a shattered planet, cratered, unstable, and bathed in a pale, rust-colored sky. Jagged cliffs surrounded a central basin that plunged into a gravity well so deep the instruments on her suit had already begun flashing red before she stepped out. She gripped the metal frame of the hatch as the artificial gravity from the ship adjusted her inner balance to match the planet's shifting pull. The announcement from the orbiting control station still echoed in her ears. Retrieve the energy core from the crater basin. Return to extraction point within 72 hours. Assistance from external AI tech boosters or planetary drones is disqualified. Team effort optional, survival mandatory. Ava had trained for this moment for 3 years, but nothing in those training modules could have prepared her for the sensation of her own body resisting movement. Every step felt like dragging her limbs through molasses made of concrete. She looked around and saw the same struggle in the others. There were 6 other cadets in her squad, each from a different species. Zarn was a towering insectoid with blade-like arms and a dense exoskeleton. He had boasted during briefing that his race evolved on high-pressure worlds. Now he grunted with each movement, his legs barely able to lift off the rock bed. Near him, Rilo, a quadrupedal creature from the gas giants of Volnthal, was whimpering under the pressure. Her species had never dealt with real gravity. She tried to move, then collapsed again, her breathing mask fogging up with moisture. Ava didn't speak. She didn't try to inspire or coordinate. This wasn't a mission that required speeches. It required survival. She took slow, deliberate steps onto the ground, wincing as her knees resisted the motion. The gravity here wasn't just heavy. It shifted, rolled, twisted like ocean waves under her skin. Gravitura's gravitational field was in flux every few meters, a side effect of its unstable core. She remembered what one of her Earth professors once said: advanced civilizations forget that basic physics still rule the universe. That line had stuck with her for years. In a room full of telekinetic species and shield generators, she had felt like a relic. But here, stripped of technology and enhancements, her mind became her only weapon. The central crater yawned ahead, nearly a kilometer wide and possibly just as deep. The core was somewhere at the bottom. There were no stairs, no guidance, no ropes, just rock, shifting gravity, and the sense that one misstep could snap bones or crush organs. She knelt slowly, letting her weight press into her boots, and pulled a piece of chalky dust from the ground. It didn't float. It didn't scatter. It pressed in like it was being swallowed. Ava tested her movement radius, lifted one boot, then another, letting herself get a feel for how her body responded in this environment. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. She was studying, calculating. Others weren't as thoughtful. Zarn tried bounding forward, misjudging a gravitational fold. His left leg dropped instantly into a small sinkhole, and a loud crack echoed through the canyon. He screamed. His leg had fractured clean through. A medical pod automatically deployed from his pack, wrapping around the injury. He was out, idiot, murmured Drek, the only other humanoid in the group. Taller than Ava, his silver skin gleaming under the low twin suns. He wore a half-cracked smile as he rolled his neck and powered on his internal stabilizers. "Let the primitives fall," he said, and strode ahead like gravity meant nothing. For a few seconds he looked triumphant. Then the ground beneath him tilted, not physically, just in the pull. His body went from upright to a horizontal sprawl in the blink of an eye. His chest plate slammed into the rock. He coughed violently, his internal stabilizers fried by the sudden shift in gravitational vectors. Ava didn't laugh. She didn't feel anything. She just took notes in her mind. Every movement on Gravitura was a negotiation. It wasn't about strength, it was about understanding the rules that kept changing. Ava pulled a coil of paracord from her pack. It was meant for climbing, but now it would serve a new purpose. She anchored one end to a jagged spike of obsidian rock and began measuring the distance between shifts. Every 20 steps she marked the cord, calculating the angles, the resistance and the lag between motion and gravitational pressure. No one noticed what she was doing. Most were too busy failing. Vilo eventually had to be med-evacuated after losing consciousness. The others were scattered, exhausted, injured, or paralyzed by fear. The instructors watching from orbit said nothing. That was part of the test. By midday, Ava had established a basic rule set. Gravity intensified in pulses every 43 seconds, then lightened slightly for 12 seconds before resetting. The fluctuations grew more violent near the crater's rim. Anyone moving during a pulse risked injury. Anyone timing their movement with the brake could make progress. She moved on the brakes, one step every 55 seconds, and with each movement she added to her chord map, weaving it between rocks, measuring angles, building what looked like a primitive grid. As night fell, though it was more of a dim shift in color than real darkness, only Ava had made it halfway to the crater's descent point. She was drenched in sweat. Her thighs burned. Her fingers ached from holding the line steady. But she had something the others didn't. A plan. She reached into her pack and retrieved a small notepad, a real paper notepad. On it she sketched diagrams of pulley systems, weight differentials, and load-bearing angles. If she could plant 2 anchor points on the crater rim and extend a reinforced cord down using counterweights made from rock clusters she'd seen earlier, she could create a vertical rig to descend into the gravity well with minimized strain. Her entire system would depend on precise mass distribution and the rhythm of Gravitura's gravitational shifts. Behind her, Drek had finally made it to the first marker and collapsed. His pride had withered away. He looked at her chord lines, then at her sketchbook. "What are you doing?" he rasped. She didn't look up. "Beating gravity," she said, and she meant it. Ava rubbed her wrists as she sat against a sloped wall of dark rock, her breath slow and controlled. The cooling suit under her outer layers hummed faintly, trying to keep her body temperature regulated, but she had turned it to the lowest setting. Power conservation was crucial now. She didn't know how long she'd be down there, and wasting energy on comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford. The wind on Gravitura 7 didn't howl. It pulsed. A low-frequency pressure wave moved through the train like breath through lungs. Every few minutes, a gust would bend the grass-like bristles growing near the crater's lip, then reverse itself. Ava watched the movement with narrowed eyes, calculating. She had built her rhythm around the gravity pulses, but now she realized wind was part of the same respiratory system this planet. It wasn't random, it was synced. She stood up again. Her legs felt heavier than before, but she adjusted. Fatigue was predictable, gravity wasn't. Still, she had data now, and data gave her control. Behind her, the anchored paracord grid stretched toward the distant landing point. Far in the distance, the others had stopped trying. Zarn was in a medical stasis shell. Rilo was gone. Drek had moved slightly forward but gave up when the second shift of gravity threw him sideways. Now he sat cross-legged, watching Ava with suspicion and a touch of respect. He didn't say anything. He knew whatever she was doing worked. Ava reached for the coiled steel cable inside her pack. It was thinner than she would have liked, but she had 200 meters of it. The energy core chamber was estimated to be around 170 meters below the rim. That gave her a narrow margin to work with. She would need to create a rig strong enough to hold not just her own body, but also the additional weight of the core, assuming she could even lift it. She examined the terrain at the rim and found 2 rock columns that seemed stable. One was angled slightly toward the crater, the other stood like a spine in the ground. She tested their base with her boots, kicked away the looser gravel, then dug small notches with her climbing axe. The columns didn't budge. That was good enough. She looped the steel cable around the first column twice, creating a fixed anchor. Then she created a second line, this time wrapping it through the head of her portable pulley, a small hand-crank device designed for lifting debris and zero-G repairs. Here it would act as her descent stabilizer. She didn't need it to lift her, just to keep her from plummeting. She lashed the pulley to the second column, then fed the cable through it, coiling the loose end into a pack she'd carry on her back. The design came together piece by piece in her mind. She would use gravity against itself. By creating a counterweight, possibly with bags of dense obsidian she'd seen near the fractured ledge, she could adjust the descent speed. The goal wasn't to fight the planet. It was to ride it like a wave. Her hands moved quickly now. She gathered rocks into her spare utility sack, testing their weight until she had what she estimated was equal to her own body mass. The more even the balance, the smoother the descent. She double-checked her knots, ensured every pulley loop was reinforced with climbing tape, then ran a stress test on the system by pulling down hard on the pack end. The line held. She took a deep breath and turned to Drek, who was still seated with his arms wrapped around his knees. "If I die," she said quietly, "tell Command it worked." "Just not long enough," he raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to die. You're too damn stubborn." That was the closest thing to encouragement she'd get from him. Ava locked herself into the harness she'd made from her seatbelt straps, cinched it around her chest and thighs, then connected the pulley's guide clip to her shoulder ring. When the system began to tighten, she felt the slight lift in her spine as the counterweight responded. It wasn't perfect. The cable swayed and the wind pushed slightly, but it would hold long enough to start the descent. The crater's edge looked like a black maw now, its mouth open to swallow her whole. She didn't look down. Instead, she pressed the lever on the pulley and took her first step backward. The system creaked, the tension shifted, and slowly, almost reverently, she began to descend into the dark. Each meter downward felt like stepping into another world. The gravitational pull changed every 5 to 6 meters, at one moment dragging her left, then suddenly pulling her head downward, then releasing her completely for 2 seconds of weightless float before catching her again. But she kept her limbs tight, never panicking, always adjusting her center of mass to realign with the shifting pull. The rock walls around her were slick with condensation that glowed faintly under UV. She realized that the core's energy was radiating upward through the minerals, making the interior shimmer like liquid crystal. She passed veins of blue stone, then streaks of gold, then complete blackness. The deeper she went, the less stable the gravitational shifts became. Some were vertical, others came in from an angle, but she trusted her rig. Around 60 meters down, one of the lower pulleys snagged. The cable jerked, and her shoulder was nearly yanked out of socket. Pain shot through her chest, but she didn't scream. She braced herself, used her left hand to stabilize the tension, then carefully shifted the angle of her body to let gravity do the rest. The snag loosened, and she continued. Time blurred, her mind focused only on calculations. 20 more meters, then 30. She paused often to let the wind pulses move past her, knowing each gust was a clue to a stronger gravitational change coming. That saved her more than once. When one wave hit from below, strong enough to almost rip her upward, she had already anchored herself to a small ledge. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only about 47 minutes, she reached the lowest landing she could stand on. Below her, a glowing pit of energy pulsed gently, violet and white, surrounded by a magnetic field that hummed through her bones. The energy core chamber. Her legs shook from fatigue and her wrists were red from the harness straps, but she allowed herself one smile. She had made it. Ava disengaged the pulley line and secured it to the wall beside her, then started setting up the second part of her plan, the retrieval path. If she could extract the core and lift it using the same counterweight principle, adjusting the rock mass to account for the core's volume, she could ascend safely. If not, she'd be trapped at the bottom with a useless victory. Her mind worked even as her body begged for rest. She tested the resonance of the magnetic field, threw a pebble toward the core chamber, and watched it dissolve in a shimmer of energy. Touching the core wouldn't be easy, but she had reached the bottom alive, and, more importantly, she had done it with nothing more than rope, stone, and the will to survive. From far above, someone shouted her name faintly, but she didn't answer. She knelt and placed her hand against the wall, feeling the vibration of the core through the stone. Ava whispered to herself, not out of fear, but respect. "This planet doesn't want us here," she murmured, "but I'll leave it better than I found it." And then she stood and began preparing the next phase. Ava brushed the sweat from her brow and tightened her grip on the edge of the narrow ledge that encircled the energy core chamber. The air near the bottom was warmer, laced with ozone and something else, something electric, that made the fine hairs on her arms stand upright. The hum of the core reverberated in her chest like a deep, slow heartbeat, and the light it gave off was steady, but oddly alive. She hadn't seen anything like it during training. This wasn't just a power source, it was a living artifact of Gravitura's unstable center. a thing that breathed and pulsed with the rhythm of the planet itself. She crouched carefully and unhooked the reinforced containment module from her lower pack. It was a cylindrical container wrapped in insulation foil and shield plating, designed to prevent critical energy feedback during extraction. She unfolded its base stabilizers, checked the internal seal, and activated the sensor grid embedded in its lid. The module emitted a faint green shimmer, indicating the containment field was active. Ava narrowed her eyes at the core's basin. It hovered slightly above a smooth stone platform, surrounded by invisible magnetic barriers that shimmered in the air like heat mirages. Touching it directly wasn't possible, but she didn't plan to. Her goal was to slide the module underneath the field's edge and let the field collapse naturally into the container. It was a gamble, and if the module didn't synchronize properly, the backlash could crush her against the wall in a blink. She positioned herself on the ledge with her knees braced wide for balance and inched the container forward on the makeshift sled she'd built out of 2 metal strips and duct-wrapped climbing rods. Each movement forward had to match the gravitational pulse intervals she had tracked earlier. Every 32 seconds came a hard vertical tug. Every 11 seconds after that came a lateral pull from the wall behind her. She had to slide the container in during the neutral pocket, which lasted only 3 seconds. The moment came, she held her breath. She pushed. The sled glided forward, the module's base sliding just underneath the field's edge. The humming grew louder, shrill and unsteady, as the containment grid made contact with the planetary resonance. The field around the core flickered once, then pulled inward. The moment the energy touched the interior of the module, a blue arc snapped through the air like lightning, followed by a loud, compressed boom that shook the cavern. Ava dove backward, gripping a stone protrusion just as the ledge cracked beneath her left foot. Pebbles rained downward, swallowed into the dark. But the module remained upright, its lid snapped shut. The green shimmer turned gold. Containment successful. She stared at the container for several seconds, her ears ringing and her heart pounding. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear but from adrenaline. She allowed herself one sharp exhale, then crawled forward and secured the module to her chest rig. It was heavier than expected, far denser than its size suggested, and it dragged slightly against her frame. But the rig held. Her harness creaked as the weight redistributed, and she reattached the lift line to the pulley hook on her back. Now came the hardest part, ascension. She pulled the cord taut and gave 3 tugs to test its integrity. The line responded with tension but no slack, confirming the counterweight she had prepared still remained in position. The pulley would bear most of the weight, but with the core strapped to her chest, her center of mass had shifted. She adjusted her posture and began the climb. The first 5 meters went smoothly. Her arms and legs moved in rhythm with the pulley's cranklock, the sound of the gears groaning beneath the stress, but never slipping. She used the ledge indentations she had mapped during descent to guide her path upward. Every time the gravity pulse swept upward, she froze, wedging her body against the wall until it passed. 10 meters. 15. At 23 meters, she noticed it, a distant creak, not from the pulley but from above. Her jaw clenched. The steel column anchoring the pulley at the rim must have shifted. Maybe the thermal feedback from the core's pulse had vibrated through the system, or maybe the wind cycles had weakened the stone base. Either way, the sound wasn't normal. She increased her speed. 30 meters. Then came the jolt. Without warning, the entire rig lurched downward, yanking her harness hard enough to slam her shoulder into the wall. Pain bloomed down her arm. She screamed once, involuntarily, as the pulley above groaned and metal scraped violently against rock. A burst of fine gravel fell from above, stinging her cheek. She braced her legs and slammed the secondary brake into the cord, stopping her fall with a sharp snap. She hung there, swaying. The sound above was worse now. Metal warping, stone cracking. One of the anchors was failing. She scanned the cliff wall around her. Nothing stable nearby. She couldn't climb freely with the core strapped to her, and if the rig failed completely, the cable would plummet with her still attached. She needed another option. Then she saw it. Far to her right, about 6 meters across and slightly higher, was a shallow niche in the wall, part of a natural rock formation she had marked earlier during descent. If she could swing into it, she might be able to brace herself while the rest of the rig collapsed. But she'd need to create a pendulum motion to reach it, and time was running out. Ava inhaled deeply and shifted her weight. The pulley groaned in protest. She began a series of small swinging motions, each timed between gravitational shifts. Each time the cord stretched forward, she used the pull to build momentum. It wasn't graceful. Her knees slammed the wall, her ribs bruised. But the arc grew wider. One more swing. She let go. Her body sailed across the gap in a narrow arc, her fingers outstretched. For a breathless second she hovered between life and death. Then her hand caught the ledge. Her nails split against the stone, but she held. With a grunt, she dragged herself into the niche, and the moment she rolled flat against it, the rig above gave way. A terrible metallic shriek echoed downward as the pulley anchor tore from its base, and the steel cable whipped past her like a snapped tendon, crashing into the depths. Her chest heaved. She lay on her side, one arm over the module strapped to her front, the other clenched around the rocky shelf. She had survived the collapse, but the ascent path was gone. Her mind surged into overdrive. The cord was lost, the pulley was destroyed, but she wasn't helpless. Her brain, not the gear, had gotten her this far. She would find another way. Above her, the crater's upper rim still stood in jagged silhouette. She could see a slope cutting around the side of the shaft. If she could climb to it, she could make her way up on foot. Slowly, carefully, but possible. The module's weight would be her biggest obstacle. She detached it from the front rig and repositioned it on her back, tying the straps tighter. Every movement sent pain through her left shoulder. She checked it, possibly dislocated, definitely swollen, but functional. She wouldn't let it stop her. With one final breath, she pulled herself out of the niche and began the long climb up the stone face of Gravitura 7. And behind her, deep in the crater's heart, the shadows stirred, whispers of ancient energy disturbed for the first time in millennia. But she didn't look back. She never did. Ava's fingers clawed at the coarse stone as she hauled her weight upward, inch by inch. The module on her back throbbed like a second spine, dense, unwieldy, and painfully unbalanced. Every movement sent sharp shocks through her shoulder, and the pressure against her ribs made breathing difficult. The slope above her looked steep but navigable. She kept her chest low to the wall and moved diagonally, pressing the soles of her boots into every crevice she could find. The wind gusted sporadically, catching her off guard and threatening to pull her off the face. She pressed in harder and waited for the pulses to pass before resuming the climb. By the time she reached the first narrow platform, her limbs trembled from overuse. Her hands were bleeding through her gloves. She collapsed to her knees, letting her forehead rest against the rock. She allowed herself only 30 seconds to stop. The longer she paused, the more the pain crept into her awareness. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. She still had another 40 meters to the crater's upper ridge, and the core wasn't going to carry itself. She lifted her head when a sound reached her ears, distant, faint but unmistakable. A cry, not an echo, not a wind distortion, but a cry for help. Ava's head snapped toward the left. She scanned the rock wall and squinted into the dim haze. There, far across the chasm, clinging to a slanted ledge, were two figures, one clinging to the other, motionless. The brighter silver hue of Drek's suit caught the low light. He was alive, but just barely. His body slumped over the edge, while his companion, a younger cadet from the Xtari race named Nirix, held onto him by the backplate. Nirix's limbs were shaking. Her species was not adapted to heavy gravity, and judging by her limp posture, she had reached the end of her strength. Ava's instincts screamed at her to keep moving upward. She was injured, exhausted, and nearly out of resources. But she couldn't ignore them. No one else had gotten this far, and if she didn't act, they would die. She clenched her jaw and sat back against the wall. She needed a plan, fast. The old pulley system was gone, but the support column near the rim was likely still usable. If she could reach it, she could anchor a new line. But without the original counterweight, she had to think differently. She couldn't lower herself down again, not with the core. But maybe she didn't have to. Ava dug into her emergency pouch and retrieved the last two coils of high-tension cord. They were designed for surface towing. Thin, but unbelievably strong. She looped them around her torso and began her climb toward the ridge, each motion calculated and brutal. Her boots scraped against the stone, and her knuckles cracked under strain. Her injured shoulder flared in agony, but she forced it to move, gritting her teeth through every surge of pain. When she reached the top, the crater's wind caught her full force, nearly sending her sprawling. She pressed low and crawled to the remaining support column, where fragments of the original pulley system still dangled uselessly. She cut away the ruined parts and lashed the new cord to the stable section. Then she secured the other end to her own body, testing the strength against her full weight. The cord didn't budge. She fashioned a makeshift hauling sling from webbing straps and tossed the loose end down the sidewall in the direction of Drek and Nirix. She had no direct line of sight, so she yelled into the wind. "Nirix, grab the cord. Silence." She shouted again, louder. Her voice cracked. Finally, a faint movement. Nirix had seen it. The Extari cadet dragged herself across the ledge, pulled the line close, and began the agonizing task of tying it around Drek's torso. Her hands shook so badly Ava worried the knot would fail. But after a few minutes, Nirix gave a weak signal. Ava took a deep breath, braced her feet, and began hauling. Every pull felt like a knife twisting into her back. The combined weight of the two cadets exceeded what she could reasonably lift alone, especially with one arm injured. But she didn't stop. She repositioned herself, dug her heels into the rock, and pulled, inch by inch. Her boots scraped backward, her ribs compressed under the harness strap, her vision blurred, but she kept her body moving in steady rhythm. She felt the rope jerk as Drek's foot caught on a ledge. She let the line slack slightly, waited for the pull to ease, then resumed. 5 meters, then 10, then 12. The strain pushed her close to collapse. Her body screamed for mercy. Then a hand appeared over the ledge. Ava lunged forward and grabbed Drek's wrist, dragging him over the rim in a single, desperate motion. He landed beside her with a groan, eyes half closed but conscious. Nirix was still dangling a few meters below. Ava dropped to her stomach, reached over the edge, and extended her arm. "Take it!" she shouted. Nirix stared at her for a second, as if she couldn't believe the voice was real. Then she lunged forward, clasping Ava's hand with both of hers. The Extari girl was light, her bones hollowed for high-altitude environments, but even her frame felt like hauling a boulder now. Ava dug in. Her muscles tore under the weight, but she lifted Nirix over the ledge and rolled onto her side, gasping. The wind shrieked above them like a warning. She ignored it. All three of them were lying together now, wounded, battered, but alive. Drek coughed and turned his head toward her. "You came back," he rasped. She didn't reply. Nirix was crying silently, her face hidden against the stone. Ava sat upright slowly, her spine protesting with every motion. She glanced at the module on her back. The seal was still intact. The golden shimmer still pulsed from the containment chamber. Mission not yet failed. She forced herself to stand, legs trembling, and extended her hand toward Drek. "We're walking out," she said. "No more shortcuts." He stared at her for a moment, then nodded and took her hand. Together, they began the slow march across the ridge, the wind pushing at their backs, the crater silent behind them. And above them, the twin suns of Gravitura emerged through the clouds for the first time in hours, casting long shadows over a planet that had almost killed them all. But hadn't. Not quite. The last ridge loomed ahead like a dark wall of exhaustion. Ava stared at it, barely seeing the path anymore, only shapes and shadows. Her body had begun to betray her. Her legs moved out of discipline now, not strength. Each step brought the sharp throb of bruised joints and muscles near failure. The harness that held the core's containment module had rubbed her shoulders raw, the skin beneath torn and damp, but she didn't stop. Not while the ridge still stood between her and the extraction point. Drek trudged beside her, one hand pressed against his cracked side panel, his pace uneven but steady. Nirix followed behind, clutching a climbing rod like a cane, her eyes dull with pain but never turning away. No one spoke. There was no energy left for words. The only sounds were boots scraping against rock, and the thin whistle of wind slicing through narrow gaps in the crater's spine. When the ground finally leveled out, Ava allowed herself to fall to one knee. The terrain here bore the unmistakable tracks of deployment, the scuffed impressions from landing skids, the half-melted patches of soil from thruster heat. The extraction beacon stood 20 meters ahead, its stasis canopy half deployed, flickering green in the settling light. She exhaled slowly. They had made it. She pulled herself upright and walked the last steps with measured pride. The module on her back pulsed with a rhythmic glow, still sealed, still stable. She reached the beacon and pressed her palm to the access panel. The canopy hissed open with a low hiss, revealing 3 stasis chambers, their interiors padded and cooled. The interface displayed vitals monitoring, automatic wound stabilization, and return confirmation. Everything worked. The system had waited for survivors. Trek sank into one of the pods without argument, the locking clamps closing over him a moment later. His face went slack as the sedative took hold. Nirix sat on the edge of the second pod, her fingers trembling. Ava helped her lie back and set the biomonitor against her wrist. The Ixtari girl looked up once, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought we were going to die in that pit." Ava met her gaze. "You didn't," she said. "That's what matters." Nirix nodded slowly and closed her eyes. The final pod stood empty. Ava hesitated for a moment, then activated the stasis unit for the core itself. She detached the module from her back and placed it inside the transport cradle. The chamber hissed shut, reading spiking, then stabilizing. Core integrity, 99.4%. Mission timestamp, completed. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the metal frame. The adrenaline that had carried her this far now bled out of her, leaving behind the truth of her condition. Her shoulder had swollen so severely that she couldn't raise her arm above her chest. Her right boot was filled with blood. Her lungs ached from hours of shallow breathing under pressure. But none of it mattered now. She sat beside the last pod and stared out at the crater's rim. In the distance, Gravitura's twin suns hung low in the sky, casting amber light across the desolate stone. For the first time since descent, the air felt quiet, not just in sound, but in pressure. The gravity pulses had lessened, their intervals expanding. The planet had calmed, almost as if acknowledging the will it had failed to crush. Above her, a soft chime sounded from the canopy. A visual flickered into the transparent heads-up interface. Extraction ship ETA 436. She allowed herself to lean back against the rock and tilted her head toward the sky. She had done what no one thought possible. She hadn't just survived Gravitura. She had mapped its rhythms, outwitted its pull, and carried others out of the pit with her. When she closed her eyes, memories surged forward in jagged flashes. The moment the cable snapped, the instant her hand caught Nirix's wrist, the feeling of gravity shifting beneath her bones as she climbed with the core strapped to her spine. It hadn't been about being strong. It had been about knowing when to resist and when to yield. That was the lesson Gravitura had carved into her soul. The extraction ship descended in a plume of slow, controlled fire. Its hull shimmered against the dimming suns. As the ramp lowered, 2 recovery officers stepped out in full gear, one heading directly for her. She tried to rise, but couldn't. The officer knelt, scanned her vitals, then nodded and spoke into his comm. Primary asset located. Human cadet Ava Monroe. Conscious, dehydrated, borderline collapse, confirming presence of core and 2 surviving cadets. A med drone hovered overhead and began scanning her shoulder. The officer placed a hydration pack against her lips, and she drank without protest. Inside the ship, the stasis pods were already secured. The module sat in a containment field of blue light, sensors orbiting around it in a slow spiral. The core would be studied for decades, perhaps even longer. But what Ava had built, what she had proven, no scanner could measure that. As the ship rose from the crater's edge, Ava looked down one last time at the world that had tested her. It didn't look like a battlefield now. It looked like a teacher. A cruel one, but not a liar. She rested her head against the padded wall, letting the low hum of the ship lull her toward sleep. Drek lay in the pod across from hers, his breathing steady. Nirix's pod emitted a soft green pulse, her vitals stable. The core's glow pulsed in time with the engine lights. Before darkness claimed her, Ava whispered to herself. Not aloud, just in thought. Strength isn't in the body, it's in the decision to keep going. And then she slept, not as a survivor, but as someone who had earned her place in the galaxy. Not through power, not through rank, but through clarity, precision, and the refusal to let anything, even a planet's wrath, tell her when to quit.